5, 4, 3. I can't.
2, 1. Welcome to Tom's introduction of the Tuck and Tom Show.
Why is it my introduction?
Because it's Vortex Week.
No. Oh, it's Vortex Week. Okay. That's right. That's right.
We're doing everything opposite this week. So I drove Tom around, and he rode on the passenger side. And today he's going to introduce the Tuck and Tom Show.
That's true, Vortex Week, and we'll talk more about this, I think, in another. Did we talk about the fact that we're opposites?
Bizarro.
We're kind of opposites. Yeah, Bizarro, Superman and Bizarro, for those of you guys who don't know. Yes. Superman has a villain that he fights who is his opposite in every way. Kryptonite makes Superman weak. Kryptonite makes Bizarro strong. The sun makes Superman strong. The sun makes Bizarro weak, which, by the way, means that Bizarro is going to struggle. Most of the time.
Big time.
If the sun weakens Bizarro.
Sorry, because he's Bizarro.
No, you're Bizarro.
You're Bizarro, Tom.
Well, that's another thing, by the way, is Bizarro doesn't realize he's Bizarro.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, so it's like...
So this week we're doing everything the opposite.
Yeah, we're Vortex.
Introduce us.
Welcome to the Tuck and Tom Show, which, is it right to call it a show?
I'll allow it.
I'll allow it. Where we follow up on questions that come in through the Wednesday night study. That came in on our Slido. So we've got some questions and we're ready to go, right?
Yep.
So since we're doing Vortex, I'm asking you the questions and you're answering?
I'll ask the questions, you answer.
Wait, but that's normal.
That's how we're gonna get back to transitioning into.
So this show is actually transitioning us back to normal
This will be our last moment of Vortex Week.
Okay.
So, Tom.
Yes.
Please talk about how the Harry Potter movies / books are appropriate in one's walk with Jesus.
It's so funny seeing this question. When I saw it last night, I was like, oh yeah. Because yesterday, it was kind of a throwaway comment, really. I mean, not throwaway. I'm not trying to...
You were making a point about your interests.
I was making a point about my interests and about obsessions, and I talk about the fact that movies ends up being kind of one of my main things. I start pointing out that movies aren't the only thing. I mean, I'm making a list, and I'm getting into what nerds love, because definitionally what a nerd is in our culture is somebody who is like obsessed with a certain...
and a lot of them like Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings is Star Wars.
And?
Well, there's also Star Trek, which I'm not much of a Star Trek fan. Although I love the Star Trek movies quite a bit. I've never really gotten into the show. I'm not a huge fan. I'm more of a Star Wars guy.
But and
Harry Potter's one.
As you were talking about nerding out over things that you're passionate about, you mentioned a list of movies that nerds often identify with that you also like.
Correct.
You threw in Harry Potter. As soon as you did, I was like, okay, well, we're probably going to have to talk about that tomorrow.
That's true.
And it's the first question on the line.
Yes, it's the one, which means it was upvoted the most. So the largest number of people are interested in the answer to that question. Yep. And for me, when I was about to say it, I was like,
you had a decision to make.
I literally was one of those split-second decisions. I'm like, this could cause me to have to say something.
Because
I'll go ahead.
People, I mean, this is a question that one person is asking on behalf of many.
Yes, there are many people.
Because many people think about, okay, sorcery, witchcraft, wands, black magic, dark magic, good magic, bad magic.
Yeah.
That's the Harry Potter universe.
Yep.
And you're saying, I'm going to read those books and watch those movies as a believer that would normally condemn witchcraft.
Yes. Okay. So
that's where the question's coming from.
Yeah. Kind of like, I mean, I'm sure some people I'm sure most of you guys out there were familiar with, I don't know if you want to call it kind of a cultural fight that took place in I'd say the late 90s, early 2000s, well into the early 2000s, where there was a very strong kind of anti-Harry Potter sentiment within the church. There was this very strong sense that Harry Potter was bad. And the main reason behind that, kind of the main thing that drove that, are essentially Old Testament injunctions against witchcraft, necromancy, mediums, wizards, all that kind of stuff, where the law expressly forbids any kind of supernatural engagement.
Don't entertain it.
Yeah, don't entertain it. Don't horoscopes, things of that nature. Yep. You don't fiddle with it. And the law was really strict about it. It actually said anybody who does this is to be put to death. And so when the Harry Potter stories come out, people would look at that and say, well, this is elevating magic and the kinds of things that we as Christians should not, of course, in any way connect with. Which, now, and just start off, let me just say, theologically, I agree 100%. Yeah, magic is something Christians should not just Christians, nobody should try to get involved with that kind of stuff. So tarot cards and astrology.
Not good.
Talking to mediums,
Ouija boards,
all of that is bad.
Yeah.
I mean, and I say bad in the worst kind of sense, because if you are trying to tap into power, usually, by the way, for selfish reasons, right? I mean, you're trying to tap into power because you're trying to gain power for yourself, and you're not doing it through the power of God in seeking him and him alone and the power that he affords. Then you are tapping into a supernatural reality that you don't know anything about. A supernatural reality that, of course,
does exist.
It does exist, and is permeated with demons and evil spirits and Satan himself, who is only too happy to kind of hook people in, right? And of course, we live in this society that is secular, but it's weirdly secular. It's like everybody in general in our society would say that things like demons and the devil don't really exist, and yet they like to fiddle with things like Ouija boards, and yet they like to read their horoscopes, and yet you know,
yeah, and the tarot cards and the astrology and identifying your personality type based off your birthday. All of those things are oddly accepted as people reject supernatural. So there is a strange, almost hypocritical sense to that. How do you go from everything you just said? To enjoying the storyline and the plot lines and all of the Harry Potter universe adventures.
Yeah, so to kind of talk, I'm going to break this up into a couple of different categories, because there's a lot of things to talk about with this subject. A lot of considerations I think people don't make when it comes to all of this. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of maybe surprise people in terms of what Harry Potter is and what it's about. In general, I think when you look back at that time in the early 2000s, when people were condemning Harry Potter, saying it was, dangerous, that kind of stuff, it's people who didn't read Harry Potter, people who didn't watch the movies, who didn't read the books, who don't know the storyline. And
probably for some of them, it was because they felt like reading it would be a violation of these convictions.
Exactly. If you read it, you can't help but come away with a completely different impression, right? When you read it, it's super clear that this series of books, these movies, it's not about elevating magic or talking about magic in the real world the way that we think about it, or trying to in any way encourage people to partake in magic or anything like that. It's a fantasy novel, and because of that, there's a world that is created in which magic is this reality, which is very different from our world, and really this is just the medium by which the story is told. The story itself, of course, is really good, and I don't just mean good in the sense that it's like well told or that it's like an interesting story, although it is those things, but rather it is good as in like the things that it's teaching in general are really good, and
valuable principles.
I'm going to explain this here in a second, but before I go any further, because I know that would put people on guard, I want to bring up something that I realized immediately. Even like I was a latecomer to Harry Potter. I was not really I didn't really land one way or the other in the early 2000s on the subject. I didn't think much about Harry Potter, didn't care until I encountered students who read it. And at some point I thought, well, I probably should read this to figure out what it's about. And then I fell in love with it. And then I was, a guy who was very much on that. But right away, I already had this thing in my mind, because people would come out and condemn Harry Potter, which I didn't care about. But I knew that the principles that they were condemning Harry Potter on must require me to also condemn the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings. There is no critique of Harry Potter that doesn't equally apply to those two.
And you weren't ready to do that.
No, because for me, the Lord of the Rings was my favorite thing in the world at that particular point. And of course, the Chronicles of Narnia were incredible. And you throw in the fact that C.S. Lewis, I looked at C.S. Lewis. Okay, so I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but it's like I had my personal mentors, people that I knew, that I respected in the faith, who taught me. But independent of that, Lewis, I looked at him as like a teacher.
He was one of your dead mentors.
He was the dead mentor to me. There was a point in my life when I was like, I don't know that I can buy into this Christianity thing. And C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, that was the thing where I'm like, not only does Christianity make sense, or can it make sense, it is the most reasonable thing out there.
So judging him by the fruit of his teachings, you were like, it is absolutely, he is pointing me to Christ. He is helping me understand Jesus. I cannot reject the fantasy world that he made.
Correct.
In Narnia.
Yeah.
Because of magic and Tolkien and
I want to be real clear on this, because I heard people try to say that their condemnation of Harry Potter didn't apply to Tolkien and Lewis. I heard people give different reasons. Their reasons all did not hold. I'm going to explain right now. They would say that, I remember hearing one guy say that magic in Chronicles of Narnia was always associated with bad things, or in Lord of the Rings. And that is not true. Gandalf is a wizard. He is one of the heroes of the Lord of the Rings. There were good wizards. There are bad wizards in Lord of the Rings. There's clearly good magic and there is bad magic. The elves were magical creatures. They could use magic. Same thing with the Chronicles of Narnia. People would say, well, the witch, the white witch, is the bad guy in in Chronicles of Narnia, which is true. But Aslan, who is the Christ figure, he also, and I'm not just throwing this word out there, he also employed magic. Mm-hmm. In fact, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when Aslan dies, they actually make reference to what they call the deeper magic.
Yes.
Right? Yep. So it's like, and then that people would say,
undoing the curse.
Correct.
Right.
Well, and also in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they encounter a good wizard, right? So you have good wizards, you have good witches, you have good magic in these stories, which, by the way, I'm not, in a true sense in this world, acknowledging that there's good magic.
But even to your point, the question should, if it's consistent, should say, can you please help me reconcile Middle Earth,
yes,
with walking with Jesus?
Yeah, it's not just Harry Potter.
Right.
I am sympathetic when Christians say, I don't know that people should read Harry Potter. I understand that. It's just, you got to be consistent with it. If you can't read Harry Potter, you shouldn't be reading Chronicles of Narnia. You shouldn't be reading Lord of the Rings either.
So that's your first
foray into that. Now, There's a second thing. People would come up and they would say, well, there is a difference. And that difference is that Tolkien and Lewis were Christians. J.K. Rowling was not. Now, at first, my first response to that, because that's what I thought when I first read them started reading the Harry Potter books, is that doesn't hold. Just because it's a Christian telling a Christian story with this medium, like I mentioned up before, this fantasy medium, that doesn't absolve it of the charge. If magic is made to look attractive in those books written by Christians, that's just as dangerous as if they're made attractive.
Should be condemned more.
Maybe even
they
more.
know the word.
Yes. Because people can come up and they can say, well, you're a Christian, you should know better.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And so there was that. But I would actually add this, and this is the thing I didn't realize. I don't think most people did, because at the time, we didn't have Twitter. We didn't have ways of mass communication. And J.K. Rowling was somewhat of a reserved person, not very public in terms of interviews and things of that nature. People didn't know a lot about her. I would say that early in the Harry Potter phenomenon, there was I think it was a Saturday Night Live skit where they made fun of Christians who were critiquing J.K. Rowling, and they had a woman come out and it was a whole skit where she acted like she was a witch and she was trying to convince everybody to be witches. It was satire, but it was actually circulated as if that was actually J.K. Rowling talking about her conspiracy to convert people to witchcraft, which wasn't true. So you had a lot of false ideas. But it wasn't until the 6th book came out. After the 6th book came out, J.K. Rowling was being interviewed. I didn't read this article, but a friend of mine who is a believer told me about it. We were just chatting, and he pointed out that in this interview, J.K. Rowling said that her hero was C.S. Lewis. And you can kind of think, if you stop and consider for a second, she's J.K., right? C.S. This is like people who love C.S. Lewis and J.K. Rowling, and I've seen this because I've had friends do it, or not J.K. Rowling, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. They copy that style of identifying themselves.
My first Twitter handle was TG Maile.
Yes, it's you use the initials. Yeah. It's like I think about a famous series that came out recently by a fantasy author where he actually added a middle initial to his, so he could get RR as his too. So it's like it's a common trope.
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling said her hero is C.S. Lewis, and this was after book 6. She in the interview said that the final book would have an Aslan Narnia kind of feel, because her biggest inspiration for the Harry Potter series was Aslan and Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia. And the guy then responded and said, "Are you a Christian?" And she says, "If I told you that, it would actually give the ending away. It would spoil the ending."
Wow.
That's when I inferred that she was a professing Christian. Of course, after the series came out, there was a big article in, I forget if it was Time or People, one of those two, which pointed out that she had long been a member of the Church of Scotland.
Wow.
And so now, by the way, I'm not trying to say, because she says all sorts of things I disagree with that I don't believe. So I'm not trying to affirm everything she says or teaches or anything like that. If someone were to say, "Do you think she's really born again?" I don't know. What I do know is she is a professing believer, and her commitment to the Church of Scotland and her faith obviously would look different from most evangelicals today, but so would Lewis and Tolkien, right? Tolkien was a Roman Catholic. Lewis didn't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, which I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, and I disagree with him on that. So it's like so it's not, her faith, of course, wouldn't be evangelical. So I'm not trying to say she's actually born again. I don't know. But what I do know is she's a professing Christian, and her goal in telling the series or in writing the series was to tell a Christ story, which now spoilers are going to come. So for anybody who actually is like reading the series or something and hasn't finished, or is watching the movies and hasn't finished.
Probably not the person who asked the question.
I am now going to give a spoiler that is essential to this. Because of course, once I realized that after the 6th book, I go, if it has an Aslan Narnia feel, I remember going in the 7th book, I thought, then Harry has to die and resurrect. He has to. That's the Aslan Narnia feel. And sure enough, for those who have read book 7, you know that happens. Harry comes to a point where he realizes that the only way to, I should add, book 7, when it comes out, is the most overtly Christian. The opening, on the front page of the book, when it comes in, there are 2 Bible verses. And one of them is, I'm forgetting the exact references, but it's where Jesus says, I think it's in John 12 maybe, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it abides alone. But if it dies, then it bears much fruit." That's the first one. And the second one is, "And the last enemy to be conquered shall be death." So those are on the title page of book 7. And those are the theme. That's the theme that weaves itself through the final book. And of course, in the kind of quintessential moment, or I should say the climactic moment of the series, Harry now realizes that the only way to defeat Voldemort, the bad guy, is to die. It's the only way. He has to choose to die for various complicated reasons. So what he does is he literally walks to Voldemort with the express intention of just letting Voldemort kill him. And as he walks, you have lines of people that are on Voldemort's side, and they're spitting on him, they're mocking him, they're laughing at him, and he's just walking very much like a what you call a Christ trope.
The march to Calvary.
Yes. And so he keeps walking, and then Voldemort kills him, and that's the end of the chapter. And the next chapter is called The King's Cross. And in the chapter called The King's Cross, Harry is now caught and this is a callback to C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which is about a bus trip from heaven to hell. Harry is caught in this middle platform. There's a train. Now, King's Cross Station is a real station in London, and that's, a lot of the book actually takes place there, but the phrase is clearly symbolic and meant to be calling the image of Christ and the King's Cross. And Harry then is faced with the reality that he can either go on to heaven, or he can choose to go back. And now that he has died as he was supposed to, he will now be able to defeat Voldemort once and for all. And so he resurrects. He comes back, he resurrects, he fights Voldemort, he defeats and vanquishes evil. The parable is just clear. Anybody who's read it, it's just so obvious.
Wow.
Now, having said that, so I say all of that to say that I defend it the same way I would defend reading the Chronicles of Narnia or The Lord of the Rings.
True to the question, how is it appropriate in one's walk with Jesus? It sounds like it is allowing this story of the cross to have another picture of what it looks like played out in another story, which that would be appropriate to think of the cross of Christ defeating evil and overcoming the final enemy of death. I mean, it's not only appropriate, it seems to be pointing you towards the picture of the cross.
The book series is absolutely a parable of the gospel. There's no question about it. And it was intended to be. This isn't like, I'm not some Christian who's just trying to read something into
You
it.
really want to watch the movie?
It's
so
a
you're like, I'm gonna
woman.
make a defense.
It's a woman whose hero was C.S. Lewis, who wanted to tell a story about the death and resurrection of Christ. And then you throw in, earlier I said that the book teaches good things. I mean, it teaches really good things. Like from book one, the opening of the series, Harry and his enemy Voldemort are depicted as two sides of one coin, meaning they both have the same power, they both have the same ability, they both are people who could be great. But Voldemort chose to do that by always seeking self, by always seeking power, by always seeking to become the greatest, and without concern for anybody else. Harry's life is completely defined from book one to the end. And they even use this phrase, by unconditional love, which incidentally, I know that in a sense, everybody uses that phrase, but not really. That's a Christian phrase. The phrase unconditional love tied with the idea of sacrifice, that is a Christian ethic. And Rowling doesn't use this in the overly sentimentalized way that I've brought up many times, how we live in this culture that says love is love and love conquers all. And what they mean by that is romance. Like Rowling hardly ever connects this idea of unconditional love to romance. The thing that saved Harry is that as a baby, like the whole series starts because the bad guy Voldemort wants to kill Harry because he's received the prophecy that Harry's going to defeat him in the end. So he goes to kill Harry, and Harry's mom sacrifices herself and dies to protect her baby. And that puts a protection over him. And that protection is unconditional love, that he experienced love. And the whole series is that. It's like you see with Harry this guy who everybody loves and wants to protect and wants to save, and then he learns that same thing.
Wow.
And then at the end, when he finally dies, it's him. That's like him coming to this full reality that he has to die to save the world. He has to die to save everybody he loves, and he's willing to do it to that extent. And for me, it's actually one of the most moving things I've ever read is when he makes that decision, when he realizes he has to die. He shows up. I'm actually going to choke up. He shows up kind of at this place, and he's scared because he's like, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can walk down there and be killed. And right at that moment, all the people who died for him show up. I can't say it. And they're like, we want to, we're with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's powerful. Now, there's one more question I want to answer with this though, because I don't want to be dismissive of the question. I think it's a legitimate question. This is a question I wrestle with, and I don't know that I can come up with a really good answer because I wanted to show the consistency. You can, as a Christian, I think, say kids shouldn't read Harry Potter. I don't want to be dismissive. Like, could a kid read Harry Potter and be interested in magic in a way that they shouldn't be? The answer is yes, absolutely. But
more so than Narnia or
no,
Lord of the
it would
Rings.
be the exact same with Narnia. It would be the exact same with Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
It's the exact same. In fact, it happens, right? I read an interview with Neil Gaiman because a lot of people look at Chronicles of Narnia, and they're like, well, that's just obviously Christian. No, it is to us because we know C.S. Lewis is a Christian. It wasn't to the kids who read it if they didn't know. Yeah. Just like with Harry Potter, most people who read Harry Potter, unless they've read the interviews, they don't know that J.K. Rowling is a Christian trying to teach a thing of the gospel. So Neil Gaiman is a famous writer today whose heroes. I find this so interesting. Neil Gaiman is an atheist. He's in any spiritual interest of his is bad. But he writes all sorts of books, all in the vein of C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and all these Christian writers, only because they were the guys he read when he was a kid. And he said that when he read Lewis, when he read the Chronicles of Narnia, which are his favorite books ever, he said he had no idea that there was any Christian meaning in them. And when he became a teenager and realized it was, he said he felt profoundly betrayed. Wow. He said he felt profoundly betrayed that his hero would try to sneak religion in against him. So we can't just take it that kids are going to read this and just automatically go, well, this is the gospel and I believe it. I read a letter from a mom that was written to C.S. Lewis back when, because Lewis famously always responded to letters if they came to him. Yeah. And so this mother wrote him and she said, I'm so concerned because my daughter says that she would rather worship Aslan than Jesus. That's what her daughter said. And she said, "What do I do?" And Lewis gave a terrible answer. Horrible. His response was, "Don't worry, it's not bad. Aslan is Jesus. He's just Jesus in this make-believe world." That's not a good answer. Aslan is not Jesus. Aslan is telling the story of Jesus. I get that you're trying to convey this idea, but he's not Jesus. And so here's my point in all of this. All humans have impulses in us to want things to be true that aren't true, right? And Narnia is one of those things that can sway people. Lord of the Rings are. It's why when the Lord of the Rings movies came out at Edwards, there was a couple who got married as Aragorn and Arwen dressed up in elven clothes. They don't want reality to be true. Yeah. They want this other thing to be true because fantasy is more pleasant than reality, right? And the reality is because of that, these things can sway people away from Jesus. They absolutely can. Star Wars is another example. I find it so interesting that people aren't quicker to condemn Star Wars.
Star Wars is much more. Yeah, I mean, it's much more Buddhist, or it's like
it's Taoist.
Taoist.
It holds that there is an impersonal force that permeates the world, and that force it conveys yin and yang.
Have Christians ever felt the way they felt about Harry Potter towards
Star Wars?
That's
the thing. No, there's never been a strong impulse against Star Wars. And I don't really know why. Because the Force, they have a different word for it, but the Force is magic.
Yeah.
And it has magicians, right?
And
the Jedi Knights are magicians.
Light, and it has,
there's dark and light, and it is a kind of, in this sense, Buddhist, in a kind of a monism. Everything is part.
Right.
And they teach it, right?
Yeah.
Who was Obi-Wan's Qui-Gon Jinn? Qui-Gon Jinn refers to things as part of the living force, right? Everything is this, we're all one. It's a very Eastern religious kind of thing. And as a kid, I wanted that to be true. I absolutely did. I wanted to be a Jedi and I wanted to tap into that reality. And so these things, they tug on the heartstrings of kids. They do. I remember when I was a kid going through an old pagan, it was Greek mythology class, reading about Zeus and about all those guys. And I remember going, I remember specifically thinking, I wish that Zeus was real and not God. Because Zeus is, of course, I'm a kid and I didn't know the stories. Zeus is actually horrible if you know the stories. But at the time, it was a world of heroes, right? So I wanted a world with Hercules and with Achilles and with all these guys. And I wanted that to be the reality.
Yeah. Who did you like the most out of the Greek gods?
Out of the Greek gods?
Achilles?
At the time, Hercules. Yeah, when I was a kid. Now I'm a fan of Prometheus.
Oh, okay.
But so here's the thing. Now somewhere along the line, before I get there, let me just say, some Christians have made the choice to say we cannot imbibe any of these stories because they will lead us astray. And I understand that impulse, and I have arguments against it because I clearly have chosen not to go that route. But I understand it, and I don't think my arguments are as strong with that. Like if somebody were to come to me and say, you know what, I'm never going to watch a movie, I'm never going to watch a TV show, I'm never going to read any book but the Bible. Could I really say they're doing something really bad? No. I mean, reading the Bible, spending your life reading the Bible is going to be it's going to be good. And people have made it through life. Most people have gone through life without being aware of any of these things.
Yeah.
I think where you're going to miss out on some of that is you might not understand the culture you live in as well. You might not be able to engage as much. I do think actually, this is kind of just as a happenstance. I think the more we read and understand stories and learn about ancient cultures and different cultures, the better I think prepared we are to understand the culture in which the Bible was written.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways that it helps us, but I can't ever say that somebody who makes that choice is bad.
But you can definitively say that it has been a blessing to your life.
I can say that reading stories like this, and like most blessings, there is a potential curse that lurks right here. Yes. Idolatry is the big curse.
Yeah.
It's easy to fall into a thing where that's what I love and that's what I want to do, right? So what I have done is I've essentially embraced C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien's philosophy about stories. And it's one that J.K. Rowling buys into. C.S. Lewis, Tolkien buy into this. And it really comes down to us from George MacDonald, who was a great Scottish preacher he was C.S. Lewis. What C.S. Lewis is to me, he was to C.S. Lewis. Yeah. Lewis actually refers to him as his teacher.
Right.
Even though they never met.
Who has an appearance in The Great Divorce.
Who appears as his guide in The Great Divorce. George MacDonald had this view of literature where he referred to literature as sacramental. When he used that word sacramental, he meant it in the way that we mean with the sacraments of communion and baptism.
The sacred.
They're sacred, but also here's the big thing about the sacraments: they're mysteries that convey truths that we can't understand. Right? So it's like when you take communion, when you eat the bread, and when you drink the cup, that is sacramental. It is a mystery. Somehow, in doing that, our mind is being engaged about the reality of the death of Jesus on the cross and on the spilling of his blood for us and on our new life in him. That through this physical expression, we understand something that we really can't understand in and of ourselves. Same thing with baptism. You're lowered into the water. Symbolically, it's washing away your sin. Symbolically, not literally. And when you come up, you're symbolically coming up into new life, right? And so what he says is the mysteries of God are best communicated through stories. And the best kinds of stories to communicate them are stories that are not set in the real world. Because now here's why. The real world as we encounter it is too literal for it. In other words, my stories in the real world are all going to, one, have no fantastic elements unless they're Christian stories, in which case all I'm doing is straightforwardly telling what God is actually doing in the world, which is good. Those stories need to be there. But if we're talking sacramental, it needs to be something that isn't real.
Bridge the gap.
It needs to be something that isn't real, that is conveying some deeper truth that I couldn't understand without tapping into it. Wow. And for MacDonald, he said, fairy tales are the way to do this, meaning literally fairies, like fairies and this, because he said there's this idea in fairy tales that there is a whole world of beings that exists under what is perceived reality. And these things bring this power infused into the world. And he said, and where else can we really understand like the mysteries of God except for in these metaphoric tales? Lewis borrows that exact same line of thinking, copying MacDonald. So did Tolkien. And then ultimately, so does Rowling, as does many other teachers. Wow. Lewis Carroll was one. So all this to say, when it comes to what you watch, when it comes to what you read, like I'm not saying read and watch whatever you feel like, because our minds do, of course, at times engage in movies, stories, television shows that hurt us, that corrupt us, that draw us into idolatry, or that sometimes draw us into bad thinking.
Like you couldn't make the same case for Game of Thrones, for example.
Yeah, exactly. But it's more than just finding a show and saying, well, there are things in this that I disagree with, therefore I won't watch it.
Yeah.
Like I do recognize that I need to watch things and engage with things I disagree with, things I don't understand, because it does actually help me see the world better. And it helps me to understand, I think, truth better. And it helps me to refine my own views. And so the big thing that I can't do right now is tell you, okay, what are the rules? I can't say these are the rules. Watch this, don't watch that.
If there's a thread of the gospel, it's okay.
Yeah.
And if you can interpret it, it's not that. I mean, so
yeah. And even if it's not a thread of the gospel, like sometimes like there's a theologian named Peter Leithart who he likes to say the devil has no stories. And what he means by that is, and this comes from an old medieval line of thinking, is that the devil can't create. All he can do is take what is real and corrupt it. Which, by the way, just as an aside, talking about George MacDonald's view of sacramental literature, I just came up with a classic example for people who I just realized it might be a little confusing what I'm saying about it. Tolkien, in his Silmarillion, describes a character who's a good character. He's not a bad character. But this character loves God so much he wants to create like God. And so he creates dwarves. All of these creatures, this is where the dwarves of Middle Earth come from. He creates all these creatures, but he can't give them life. And he weeps, and he's weeping because he can't make them alive. And then God comes to him because God exists in that universe. And God says to this being who's like an angel, he's like incredibly powerful, more powerful than Gandalf or Sauron or any of those characters. And God comes to him, he says, don't you understand, my son, that you cannot impart life? All creation can do is take what is already made and interact with it. They can't make it. And so the dwarves only come to life because God says, but because I love you, I will give life to these creatures. And so he wanted to create life, but he couldn't. But then the bad guy in The Lord of the Rings, who Sauron is just one of them. He's not the main bad guy. The main bad guy, Melkor, he also wants to create, but he can't. So what does he do? He takes existing living creatures, he torments them and tortures them until they become unrecognizable. Orcs, right? So the orcs are just other kinds of creatures. Wow. And so the point being, the devil can't make his own stories. He can't create anything because he has no artistic impulse. All he can do is take what God made and corrupt it and make it worse. And so anyway, Dr. Lightheart, this theologian, he says the devil doesn't have any of his own stories. He can only take God's stories and twist them. And so that being said, I teach at a classical Christian school where we teach classical literature. Classical literature not only means often non-Christian literature, it often means pagan literature. The Iliad, the Odyssey, all of those kinds of things. Those are literally books about pagans, right? And so about pagan gods. And so, but when you read them though, you can so see through them. How God is reaching through and telling stories, and Satan is trying to twist it. It's like what God intended for good, Satan has used for evil. And anything humans create are going to be like that. So I think that there are some things that Satan has so twisted and warped, we should have nothing to do with them. There are obvious examples, right? Pornography. Anything that's just clearly pornographic, there's no reason. Yeah. That offers nothing. There are certain kinds of violent storytelling that I would say is pornographic in a sense, where its violence is so extreme and so unnecessary. It's like, there's nothing here. Yeah. This is so twisted. But then there are stories, which it's like in the midst of the story, God is saying something. And at the same time, Satan is always trying to say that good thing and twist it. Incidentally, he does that with the scripture itself. Yes. That's what he's doing with Jesus when he tempts him in the wilderness, right? He's taking real scriptures and he's twisting them. Wow. And so I kind of follow along that line. All stories are God's stories, and Satan is always trying to twist them. So because I love story, and because I think story reveals the truth of God in a way that I could never understand otherwise, I want to read them. I want to hear them. I want to tell them. I want to watch them. I want to, that kind of thing. I'm not really obsessed with movies. I'm obsessed with stories. Yes. Right? That's what it really comes down to.
And you're inspired by stories. And
I'm inspired by stories.
People love your teaching because you tell stories.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
And you get stories from, how do you even know how to tell a story? You have to read them, and you have to watch them unfold, and then you have to learn how your life is actually a collection of stories, which comes from loving stories. Yes. So hopefully that helps this person as their hand hovers over the Harry Potter book, whether to read or not. That's up to you, but I think that you can certainly find your Christian liberty giving you the grace to read them and even be blessed by them. Yeah. And for a part 2 deep dive, I'm excited for someone to ask the question how you can justify watching horror movies. That will be another episode, but I think you have explained to me some things about even that genre of movies that would be surprising to some Christians, that there are gospel themes in even that genre. Yeah. Yeah. So we have time to...
We do. I think we can get through a lot of these.
We have time to go quickly.
Yes,
we have time to go quickly.
Let's go.
That was the entree of this show.
That's true.
That was, to me, a steak that was pink in the middle with a perfect amount of peppercorn sauce on top.
Nice.
Wow, that was amazing.
Awesome.
But we are going to go speed round.
We have
about 15 minutes to get through the rest of them. And then I'm excited for our next venture of life after this podcast. That'll be really fun. Number 2, is Revelation actually just apocalyptic literature? Doesn't Revelation chapter 1, verse 19 point out it is the past, present, and the future? As a result, should we read Revelation as just futuristic?
Okay, so now forgive me, whoever wrote this question.
Because of the speed round.
Yeah, forgive me, whoever wrote this question. I might be misinterpreting it. So if I don't get it right, what you're asking... feel free to shoot in another question next time, and I'll try to answer it. But the way I'm understanding this question is in last night's study, I said that Revelation was apocalyptic literature. I actually didn't say it was just apocalyptic literature. I said or maybe I did actually use that phrase, but
I think you belabored the freedom by which we are to not freedom, but the license by which we are to try to understand when it is and when it isn't.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So like Daniel has apocalyptic sections, like many of the ones we've read, the descriptions of the beasts are apocalyptic, but then it has parts that aren't. Like chapter 1, when Daniel is taken into captivity and is brought into, that's just history. Revelation, what I meant to say, if I might have said it was just apocalyptic, is the most fully expressed book of apocalypse or apocalyptic literature that we have in the New Testament. But I do want to say the second part of the question but Revelation 1:19 says that, of course, John is supposed to report the things that he has seen, the things which were, the things which are, and the things which will be. So the way I interpret this question is by me saying that it's apocalyptic, that I'm implying that it needs to be all about the future. And that's not the case. Apocalypse just has to do with the nature of the vision. Like when you read when you read about these symbolic visions, those are apocalyptic visions. Symbolic visions do not need to be about the distant future, nor even about the future per se. So when I say it's apocalyptic, I don't mean to say it's only about the future. That's not the case. So I just wasn't saying that.
No, that's good. And great. Question number 2 is, that was quick, concise.
Thanks.
Yeah, good job to you. You're very smart. In chapter 2, verse 5, since this is addressing the whole church body there, making the point that they are not keeping each other fired up.
Yes, you're right. So I do want to make clear on this that I'm teaching through these letters. The primary meaning of every one of these letters is a rebuke to an individual church, to the whole church, not to an individual person. I do sometimes, as I'm reading through, give application to us as individuals to say, this is true of the church as a whole in Ephesus at this time, for instance, losing their first love. But it also is true, I think, sometimes of us individually, me leaving my first love. But yes, the person who asked this question, you are correct that it's actually a statement that is meant to be given to the church, that we're supposed to be provoking each other to returning to their first love. That's absolutely correct. And I'm sorry if I didn't quite make that clear as I was going through it. But yes, it is primarily to the church about what the church needs to be doing. But I also think that many of these things just applicationally, also are things that we individually wrestle with.
Last night you mentioned Galatians 4, so now we have a Galatians 4 question come up. There are now folks going around and talking about how there is a goddess in heaven who is God's wife, and they pointed to Galatians chapter 4, verse 23 as some sort of proof text of that. What is the best way for this person who wants to refute this concept? How do they reply?
Yeah, so I do have to say I haven't heard this. So I've not encountered folks going around talking about a goddess in heaven. I also have not heard of
this, but of course, people go around and talk about everything.
That's true. People have, I mean, there are so many ideas out there. And certainly we live in a society where people really want to at least misgender God or degender God, if you will, and try to, or maybe agender him to say he doesn't have a gender, and therefore we'll use a feminine, like refer to God as mother or something like that. That's a very posh thing to do in our culture. So maybe it's that. I'm not really sure. But one thing I can say is Galatians 4:23 is not, when it talks about the mother, Sarah or Hagar, it's not talking about like God's wife. It's talking about literally Abraham's 2 wives, Sarah and Hagar. So the answer is that verse isn't about God. It's about Abraham and his wives, Sarah and Hagar. And then Paul metaphorically refers to Sarah as like our mother, not our mother in heaven. No. Not God the mother.
In promise.
In promise, in the sense that Sarah actually had a son.
Yeah.
Sarah had a son.
A miracle child.
A miracle child. And Isaac, he had a son. He had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. And then as you follow that down, you get to Paul. Paul was a descendant of Jacob. So from the Jewish perspective, Sarah is their mother, not mother God. She's like physically, she's like their great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. And Hagar was the mother of Ishmael. And so the descendants of Ishmael, which are Arabs, Hagar is their mother, literally, physically, not the mother of God, or not the wife of God or something. And then here he just metaphorically says that if you are a child of faith, that is the faith of Abraham, then in that way Sarah is like spiritually your mother. But that's not anything about anyone in heaven.
So that one, God. If they literally are using Galatians chapter 4, verse 23, you can just say,
it's not about
regardless of what you think about the heavenly realm and a feminine spirit, this is not what Galatians chapter 4 is saying.
Correct.
In regards to the last Q&A where you discuss predestination versus free will, can you give us your thoughts on the theology of middle knowledge, aka Molinism?
Yes. So this is a question. I love it when the names here. I saw Luke on the last name. I know some Luke, so I'm not sure if I know for sure who that was. But on this one, the last Ronin, that is a like a pen name, so to speak, of one of my good friends, Caleb Smith.
Oh, cool.
And so he's asking the question here about Molinism, which I want to try to give a quick view of Molinism. So this is in the context of the debate over predestination and free will, right? So if I'm given kind of classic teaching in Protestantism on this, free will would be the Arian view, right? Arianism or Arianism or Wesleyanism, and then predestination would be the Calvinist view. Molinism, it's a theology or a philosophy that comes from a guy named Luis de Molina, who was a Jesuit priest. So it's a Catholic view on, it's a Catholic view. That is, he was a Catholic, but Protestants do embrace this view. It's a Catholic view on the tension between predestination and free will. And Molinism's kind of hard to explain, but it essentially is this. Molina basically taught that God, he knew all possibilities that could ever exist. So, for instance, Tucker and I are here right now. Tucker's wearing a black hat and it's on backwards. God would know what would happen if things were just slightly different and Tucker had chosen not to put the hat on. And following from that would be a whole change to the nature of the world. If you've ever heard the story, like the butterfly effect, that whole thing, it's this time travel thing where a guy goes back in time, steps on a butterfly, and then goes back forward in time, and everything's changed. The idea being that if even one thing in the world is slightly different, it changes the whole outcome. Molina basically says that God knows every possible reality that could come out, every possible one. From every choice. I chose this morning to wake up at 7:10 in the morning. He knows exactly how the world would be different for all eternity if I had woken up at 7:09. He knows exactly what would happen if I chose to receive Christ at a later date than I did, or if I never did. He knows exactly how every single possible thing would be different. And what Molina says is, looking at every possible world, like every possible world that could have come, he looked through it all and he saw one way that seemed the best way, and he chose to actualize that one. So in that sense, God did predestine everything that happened because that's the reality he chose to make real. But on Molina's view, this preserves free will because he chose this one of an infinite number of possibilities. And that means that in this world that he chose, every single free will decision that was made in that world was their decision. He just chose this one as opposed to a different world where they made different decisions. Does that kind of make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really complicated.
It almost needs a fantasy novel to explain it.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, it really does. So Caleb here is asking me, how do I think about Molinism, or do I
By the
agree
way,
with
is
it?
it good etiquette to give away someone's pen name over the podcast? I mean, he chose the
I
pen
don't
name.
think he's trying to hide it.
Yeah, maybe he is. I mean, he did.
But that's just his screen name. He always has it that way. So
Okay.
maybe he is. I don't know.
You
Sorry,
could've put
Caleb. I'm sorry if that's the case.
Caleb, you just keep using his non-preferred handle here.
Yes, that's true. Anyway, so Ronin,
The last
Ronin,
not the first.
Not the first. I myself don't have a strong opinion about Molinism. I find it interesting. I think of it as a theory that might be true. It's certainly not one that I rule out, but I haven't really embraced it either.
And there are some biblical moments, where it seems to be like when King David's like, isn't there a moment where David's wondering whether he should go to battle or not? And the Lord tells him if he goes, what will happen?
Yes.
And so there's moments where it's like, okay, the Lord knows
Yep.
what would happen if he made a decision. And there's no denying that would be true.
Yes. Now, well, that's what makes this tricky. There are passages in the Bible which seem like they would be consistent with Molinism. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, what you just described. Passages where God seems to say that if things go a certain way or went a certain way, it would be different. Yeah. Another example would be Moses. Shortly after the children of Israel build the golden calf and they all dance around and worship it, God tells Moses, stand aside, I'm going to destroy this people and I'm going to turn you into a nation.
Yeah.
And Moses is like, don't do this.
He's like, I know what would happen if I destroy this.
Exactly. It's like so I think in order for that to be true, something like Molinism should be true, which is that if God destroys the people, then Moses becomes the nation. That's what that means.
The Ninevites, if they don't repent, there's warnings that the prophets can give that would tell you what will happen if you don't obey, right?
And then that case with David, he's asking whether or not he should attack somebody.
Right.
And if he does, will this thing happen? And he tells him what will happen.
Yeah.
And David doesn't do it. So it's like, that seems to imply a Molinistic view. However, there are verses that seem to be against it. And I'll give you one example. That's Abraham offering up Isaac on the altar. When he goes, he takes the knife to kill Isaac, and right then an angel appears. And then God, through the angel, says to Abraham, now I know that you will not withhold anything from me. The implication being that if Abraham didn't actually do it, God wouldn't have known it in the way that Molina seems to imply he would have known it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So all that to say, I don't know. I'm torn between the two. I really find Molinism interesting. And it's one of those views that I think is certainly possibly true, but I don't embrace it as like definitely true.
Well, blessed are the peacemakers who try to find the common ground in the debates. Let's save this next one for last.
Okay.
Well, let's hold off here. Do you believe the letters to the 7 churches are a
chiasmus?
A chiasmus.
So a chiasmus, just so you guys know, it's a poetical device in which everything kind of so a typical rhyme scheme, like in a Shakespearean sonnet, it's A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, right? Meaning that you have a rhyme right there. In a chiasmus, it's like a rhythm scheme or a rhyme scheme in which it's kind of a mirror image of itself. So A, B, B, A would be an example of a chiasmus. A mirrors A over here, and then B and B mirror each other.
B mirrors B, A.
Yeah. Or A, B, C mirrors C, B, A.
Right.
It's like, that's the chiasmus structure is what they call it. And I saw this question and I was like, goodness, do the letters have a chiasmus structure? And the answer to this question is easy. I don't know.
Okay.
I need to actually sit down and look into it. I've never thought of that. And it might actually take me digging into some commentaries that I don't have, because the commentaries I've been reading, at least lately, they don't talk about a chiasmic structure. So I need to actually look into it. So maybe ask it again after I'm done with the letters, and I might be able to. This is
one of our most popular, question persons. It's anonymous, so where most of our questions come from.
Yeah.
You spoke of circumcision, and I'm curious. The Bible makes a big deal about it. Does the decision to circumcise carry any significance today for a Christian?
So this question is one it's one that I could spend a lot of time talking about because there's a lot of scriptural verses on it. But it's also an easy one. And the answer is no.
Yeah.
Circumcision has no application for the Christian today spiritually. And my answer is essentially, if you go back and you look at what I was describing yesterday, Romans, Acts 15. Actually, Acts 15 is a great one to turn to. That's the Council of Jerusalem.
Where they make the decision.
They make the decision because what was happening, this is what I was addressing yesterday, kind of what I brought up yesterday. The children of Israel, the early Christians were all Jews. To be a Jew, to be part of that covenant, you had to be circumcised. But when Gentiles started to convert to Christianity, some of these Jewish Christians were like, well, if you're going to become a Christian, you got to get circumcised. And that's a tough thing for these people. And so what happened is in Acts 15, all the church leaders get together. And Peter and Paul and Barnabas, they all testify what they think is true. And at the end, James, who's one of the leaders in Jerusalem, he calls everybody together and says, well, this is the answer. Yep. You don't have to get circumcised. You don't have to get circumcised to be a Christian. And then if you look at, especially the book of Galatians, the whole book is really about that question. Paul, in it, he's actually so frustrated with Jewish Christians who are telling people that they have to get circumcised that he actually goes so far as to say, I wish they just cut the whole thing off. He was like, he didn't really mean that, like in the sense, it was just like, it was an expression of his frustration. Yeah. And so it's very clear. Romans, Galatians, Ephesians even a bit, definitely Acts 15. Christians do not have to get circumcised. Circumcision is a symbol of the old Jewish covenant. And so people who are born as Jews, they still, of course, get circumcised.
And a shadow of things to come.
And it's a shadow of things to come. But no, circumcision does not apply in the church today. By the way, if you are circumcised, it's not bad either. It's not.
It's your business.
It's
That's
not.
your-
It's
That's their
yeah.
business. Right?
The New Testament just points out that it's not. It
Yes.
does not pertain.
Right. Are we down to our last question?
Yes.
Oh, well, as what would be a podcast of you and I talking about the book of Revelation without our boy Stephen Reynolds asking his weekly question. He says this: I didn't make it in because I thought Vacation Bible School was happening. Regardless, is Jesus coming back soon? I still have no answer.
I really want to find out who's saying this one because Stephen Reynolds was at last night, was at church last night. So I know Stephen is not actually sending these in. So
giving all sorts, you're putting people
Is
on
it you?
blast.
Is it you?
You're putting people on blast, not me.
is that you?
No.
Okay.
No.
But anyway, no, we still don't know.
But the answer is yes.
The answer, I still
He's
have.
coming quickly.
Oh, that's true.
The
He's
answer is
coming
yes.
quickly.
He's
And
coming.
it's always true.
See, the question's been rephrased for this one. He used to ask, when is Jesus coming back?
Oh, that's right. But
Now, maybe this is a flub on his part. He said, is Jesus coming back soon? The answer to that one is actually yes.
it's always yes.
It's yes.
It was yes 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's yes.
Yeah.
And when you have the view of eternity, when we look back on this entire story that's unfolding before us, it was as quick as a blink of an eye.
Yep.
So,
Yep. As
Wow.
with God, a day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as a day.
and we look forward eagerly to his return. And until then, we take communion, expecting it to be very soon.
Yeah.
So, right
All right.
on, man.
That
I'm
was good.
surprised you didn't get any questions about your, the way you just diminished the work of Coldplay. But thankful,
I love Coldplay.
excited.
Actually,
Hey, if you haven't noticed, if you ask him a question about movies or literature, you are going to get one of the best answers on the internet, bar none. So thank you for asking. Until next
Thanks,
time,
guys.
Thanks for tuning in. Tom and I are now rushing over to the pastor's lunch. Are you excited for that?
Yes, I'm excited.
Committed on
for
air.
you.
Committed
I'm
on air.
excited for you.
Committed on air. We got to go. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks,
Let's
guys.
go to that lunch together.
Okay.
Committed on air. Got him.
Yeah.
Get committed. And
See you guys.
You cannot lie, dude.